Thanks, Nigel. Thanks everyone for hanging in there for the last session. Just like to start off with a few thanks. Firstly, for Wine Australia for supporting a scholarship with Nuffield. We can sometimes get into a bit of a bubble in our own industries, and I think it's really important that wine industry scholars are mixing with more traditional agricultural enterprises, because we learn a lot. Also like to say thanks to my parents for supporting me and coming up to have a look today, and also to my lovely wife Jen. Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about alternative varieties. Before I do that, I'll just let you know where I'm from. So I'm from Orange in central west New South Wales. We're on a 1,200 acre vineyard there, growing mostly traditional French cultivars or varieties. So Shiraz, Cabernet and Merlot, the ones that you've probably all heard about. It's a cool climate wine region, 4 hours west of Sydney, growing quite well. So the objectives of my topic, I wanted to try to identify alternative varieties that are going to increase the demand and premium paid for Australian wine. I wanted to try and find varieties that are going to better suit Australia's climate. Historically, the varieties we're growing at the moment came out with the first fleet. And I guess try to find some varieties that are going to suit a climate that's changing, throwing more curveballs at us, and also varieties that a changing consumer might want to drink. So I'll just maybe quickly highlight what an alternative grapevine variety is. It's just something that's not common or widely grown. And I guess why do we need them? So 60% of Australia's grapevines grown are coming from 3 varieties, Shiraz, Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon. So that's putting a fair few eggs in one basket from where I sit. All the other cultivars on that chart are all originating out of France and Northern Europe. And yeah, just looking at our climate, that may not be exactly the same as France and Northern Europe. Sure, there are some areas that are similar, but a lot that aren't. And yeah, I guess if we've got a changing climate, it's having a bit of an impact on our industry the last 10 to 15 years. We're starting to see varieties are ripening earlier, and that's having a couple of impacts. Those varieties are ripening in the warmer months now, and that's changing the flavour profiles of what ends up into the winery and then in the bottle. And it's also putting a lot of pressure on our resources. Fermentation space, if everything's ripening earlier and at once, wineries only have a certain amount of fermentation space, so that's going to mean fruit has to hang out on the vine, lose volume, lose quality. You've also got to try and pick all this fruit at once, so that's putting labour resources under pressure, transport resources under pressure. And I guess, yeah, the other reason is customers. Consumers' attitudes are changing. They're not necessarily wanting to drink what their parents drank in the past. They're much more adventurous, I think. And we're also coming under a bit of pressure from different categories, so craft beer, craft spirits, and that sort of thing. So I had this wonderful Nuffield Scholarship, so where did I go? We started off in Greece, off to Armenia and Georgia, Portugal and Spain and the UK. So in Greece, we started up the top near Macedonia, and we travelled all the way down to Crete. And what I'm going to do is, for each of these countries and regions, just highlight a couple of varieties. There are 53 in the report, so I'm not going to go through them all now. But 2 varieties that really stood out in Greece, a white and a red. One was called Pleto, a white variety, and Limniona, a red variety. Pleto was pretty extraordinary. Massive big leaves, lower percentage of stomates underneath the leaves, so that gives us a sense that a lower amount of stomates under the leaves means it's going to reduce evapotranspiration coming out of those leaves. So this variety stood up really well in warm and dry conditions, which we saw on Crete. It was able to hold its acid really well right up until harvest, and that's important. So it's an addition that the winemaker does not have to make in the winery. Nice big bunches, thick skins. You'll see thick skins repeated on a few of these slides. Thick skins are important to us to protect the cultivar or the bunch from pests and diseases. It's quite a vigorous and productive variety, so good for growers. Limniona made a lovely, soft, round, cuddly sort of wines. They're not big tannic blockbusters, and the consumer research that I did during my studies was showing that younger customers particularly are moving away from those big blockbusters, tannic style wines. Really went well in warm days and cool nights. Late ripening for Limniona as well, and you might see that a few times. I've been trying to find a few varieties that are late ripening, and sometimes that can prove a bit of a challenge because later ripening varieties are ripening later in the season when the season may start to break, which can mean ripening becomes a bit of a challenge. But we've sort of noticed that the later ripening varieties are developing their flavours and ripening now in those cooler months, and we're ending up with better wines as a result. After Greece, we headed over to Armenia and Georgia. It could be probably classified as the cradle of winemaking. We saw evidence and remains of winemaking dating back 8,000 years, which was pretty mind-blowing. They were very interesting countries to visit. The capital cities were very cosmopolitan, quite modern, but as soon as you got out of those capital cities, infrastructure was a real challenge. Agricultural practices were very agricultural. But there were a few really big, impressive vineyards growing some interesting varieties. Two of those varieties, one was called Garuli Matsvani and the other was Areni. Areni was very impressive. It was probably what I'd term a plastic variety. It was able to grow down as low as 300 metres above sea level, right up to 1,600 metres, and consistently producing a quality wine. The characteristics would be different depending on where it's grown, but was very malleable. Garuli Matsvani, pretty impressive as well, vigorous, productive, and was made over there in a range of styles: sweet, sparkling, semi-sweet, or dry. On to Portugal, pretty old and proud wine-growing nation. It's not all about port in Portugal. We're up in the north in the Douro Valley, which is the photograph there on the left. And we travelled down far south as the Azatão region, which is well below Lisbon. Two varieties, Gouveio and Touriga Franca. Gouveio, that photograph was taken just before harvest, the morning of harvest, and it had lovely fresh fruit flavours, but the most impressive thing for me was really lively acidity in the fruit, 8 grams per litre, which is very impressive for a white cultivar in a fairly dry, warm environment. Touriga Franca is traditionally a variety that's used in port production, but we're seeing more and more of this variety used as table wine over in Portugal. Nice thick skins, and it has a real affinity with dry sites. On to Spain. I had a wonderful visit to University of Rioja, probably Spain's premium wine or premier wine growing region. I was lucky enough to visit the university to have a look at their national collection and also, very timely, their post-harvest meeting. So I wish my Spanish was a bit better, but it was good to be able to hear what the growers went through during their season and how they are coping with some of the challenges that we're facing here as well. Two varieties I guess I identified there were Tempranillo Blanco and Bobal. Tempranillo Blanco, people may have already heard of Tempranillo. Tempranillo Blanco is a white mutation, and it has some of the similar growing characteristics of Tempranillo, but producing really aromatic white wine. Bobal was probably the most drought-tolerant variety that I found on the whole of the travel. It's grown mostly around Valencia, and traditionally hasn't been made so well because it crops quite heavily, and the Spanish growers go to town with it and produce as much as they can. But the smart growers were using all the benefits of growing in a dry region, bringing the yields back a bit and producing really impressive dry red table wines. And I visited the UK not to have a look at the growing wine industry in the UK, which is going through a period of growth, but rather had a really good visit with Wine Australia. They have an office in Australia House, and the UK is our biggest market by volume. So I wanted to get a sense of where the market was in the UK as well as Australia, but particularly in the UK, around the feeling of traditional varieties versus alternative varieties. It was interesting to see that Wine Australia have for the last 2 years, been holding tastings specifically on alternative varieties, and they've had some really good uptake. So some outcomes. Consumers are definitely looking for point of difference now. They're certainly not settling for Chardonnay, Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc. They're looking for new experiences. They're looking for products that do have some level of green credentials, so whether that's an organic certification, vegan friendly, or just a product that's grown in the right place, that's requiring less inputs. Customers are drinking less across all categories, not just wine, but they're prepared to pay a little bit more, which bodes well for our industry. Imports of wine into Australia are increasing, and I guess what I'd like to see is that if a customer wants to buy an alternative variety, fine, buy it from Italy first, but the next purchase of that variety they make, I want it to be an Australian wine. And the report's got 53 alternative varieties, which I hope you all read. There are still some challenges though, pronunciation for one. Customers are pretty wary. They're not going to pick up a bottle of wine if they find it hard to pronounce. Moshafilero and Tukwari don't really roll off the tongue too easily. And local knowledge on how to grow these varieties and how to vinify them will make the wine. It's all good and well. Aussie farmers are really good. They can grow just about anything, but getting it right in the paddock and getting it right in the winery, you do need some of the local knowledge that's specific to each of these cultivars. Pathogen status is also an issue. Most varieties I saw in Greece had a significant viral load, but that's an issue that can be overcome, but we've just got to be really wary of it. And there's long lead times for bringing material in. You're probably talking 5 to 8 years to get it through quarantine, through virus testing and into the ground, and that's before propagation. So where do these fit in? Not just for the warm inland regions, although they've got a lot of appeal. 80% of Australia's 1.8 million tonnes of wine grapes grown last year come from warm inland regions. So I think they've got a really good fit there. But a variety like Armenia, Touriga Franca, some of these varieties will produce really lovely wines in warm and cool climates. And I think they're a good fit for small to medium-sized businesses. I think the large corporates that are in the wine industry, they're going to do their own thing. They're going to concentrate on the mass market, and that's all good. But I think these alternative varieties, if they're grown and sold by small businesses that have a connection with their customers, can be hand-sold into the on-trade, that have the ability to educate their customers and have the sales platform, so cellar doors and direct-to-consumer mailing lists. And I think if these smaller businesses take them on, they're going to be able to achieve higher price points. So some of the recommendations in the report, I think we need to do a refresh of exactly what we have in our national collections in Australia, which is happening at the moment. Some of the varieties in the report are already in Australia, but off a very small base. Some of them are in our national collection that no one knows about. So I think first things first, we need to know what we have. Varieties that we do have, I think we should get some small plot trials going in different regions around the country so growers can see how they perform in the vineyard, see how they perform in the winery. And I think we should start bringing some of this material in. Obviously there's an enormous amount of varieties there, so we've got plenty of time to do it, but I think we've got to make a start. Obviously they've got to clear quarantine, and we've got to make sure we're bringing clean material in, or if it's not clean, it's got to be clean once it's here, added to the next collection. And I'm happy to say that we do have the bodies in Australia to be able to do this. Wine Australia, CSIRO are very interested in this type of thing. We've got the Australian Vine Improvement Association, and then we've got all our state and regional vine improvement groups and DPIs. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your attention.